The line moved forward with a slow, tedious rhythm of a clock that was ticking just a little too slowly. Inside the narrow carpeted corridor of the jet bridge, the air was cool and smelled faintly of heated dust and jet fuel. The man in the sharp, charcoal gray suit checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. It was a heavy, expensive watch, the kind that felt weighty on the wrist and served as a silent proclamation of success. He let out a sharp sigh, shifting his weight from one polished leather loafer to the other. He hated waiting. In his world, time was the one commodity you could never buy back, no matter how many zeros sat in your bank account. Ahead of him, the gate agent scanned boarding passes with a robotic beep, beep, beep. The man held his phone loosely in his hand, the screen glowing with a stream of urgent emails. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a man of importance, a mover and shaker who had deals closing in 3 different time zones. He belonged in the front of the plane, far away from the cramped chaos of economy class. As he finally reached the agent, he offered a tight, professional smile. She scanned his pass, wished him a pleasant flight, and he stepped onto the plane. The transition was immediate. The narrow utilitarian jet bridge opened up into the wide, inviting cabin of first class. The lighting was softer here, a warm amber hue that seemed to promise luxury and comfort. The air smelled of fresh coffee and expensive cologne. He walked down the aisle, his eyes briefly scanning the spacious seats, the plush upholstery, and the personal touchscreens waiting to be used. This was his sanctuary. This was where he could escape the noise of the world and exist in a bubble of peaceful productivity. He found his seat, a window spot in the second row. Setting his leather briefcase down gently, he removed his jacket and hung it in the small closet nearby with careful precision. He smoothed the front of his tailored shirt and sat down. The seat enveloped him, wide and soft, adjusting to his weight instantly. He felt his shoulders drop, the tension of the morning beginning to drain away. He reached for the amenity kit, admiring the branded toiletries inside, and placed them neatly in the pocket. Everything was in order. Everything was perfect. A flight attendant appeared at his side almost immediately, holding a tray of sparkling water and orange juice. She smiled warmly, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good morning, sir. Can I get you something to drink before we take off?" she asked, her voice low and respectful. "Just water, please," he said, his tone clipped but not unkind. "Sparkling." "Of course." She handed him a crystal glass. "We will be departing shortly. Just let us know if you need anything at all." He took a sip, the cold bubbles popping against his lips. He leaned back, closed his eyes for a brief moment, enjoying the rare silence. Around him, the other first-class passengers were settling in. There was a woman in a silk scarf typing rapidly on a tablet, and an older man adjusting his reading glasses. It was a quiet, civilized environment. It was exactly what he paid for. Then, the subtle hum of the cabin was broken by a disturbance near the entrance. The man opened his eyes and looked up. The line of boarding passengers had thinned out, but one person was still lingering in the aisle. The businessman frowned, his patience fraying at the edges. He watched as a figure shuffled slowly down the carpeted walkway. It was a man, but he looked nothing like the usual first-class crowd. He was wearing a faded navy blue baseball cap, pulled low over his eyes. His hair, peeking out from under the cap, was dark and slightly messy. He wore a simple, well-worn flannel shirt over a basic white t-shirt, and his jeans were old, fraying slightly at the hems. On his feet were a pair of battered black boots that looked like they had seen better days, perhaps years ago. He carried a small, canvas backpack slung over one shoulder, looking heavy and burdensome. The businessman watched the stranger with a growing sense of annoyance. He could understand why someone dressed so casually, so carelessly, was occupying space in the premium cabin. In the businessman's mind, first class was a uniform. You wore a suit or at least smart casual attire. You looked the part. You respected the environment. This man looked like he had just rolled out of bed and wandered in off the street. The stranger moved slowly, stopping to let a flight attendant pass by with a cart. He offered her a shy nod and a mumbled apology, stepping aside with a hunch of his shoulders. He seemed tired, almost heavy with exhaustion. The businessman felt a curl of disgust in his stomach. Why did people have to be so slow? Why did they have to take up space? The stranger continued down the aisle. He was looking at the seat numbers, his head bobbing slightly as he read the overhead indicators. The businessman watched him come closer, silently praying that he would keep walking. Please let him sit in the back. The man thought. Let him sit anywhere else. But luck was not on his side. The stranger stopped right next to the businessman's row. He looked at the number on the overhead bin, then down at the boarding pass in his hand. He looked at the empty seat next to the businessman. The businessman's heart sank. He was going to be sitting next to the backpacker the entire flight. He felt a flash of irrational anger. This was supposed to be his quiet space. This was supposed to be a seat for a peer, another professional, someone who understood the unwritten rules of flying first class. Instead, he was going to be wedged next to someone who looked like they belonged on a Greyhound bus. The stranger shifted his backpack, unhooking it from his shoulder. He struggled for a moment with the overhead bin. It was stuck, or perhaps he didn't have the strength to push it up on the first try. He grunted softly, his face flushing red with embarrassment as he gave it another shove. Finally, with a dull thud, the bin latched shut. The businessman stared pointedly out the window, refusing to make eye contact. He didn't want to encourage him. He didn't want to acknowledge his existence. He just wanted him to sit down and disappear. The stranger let out a long, weary breath and collapsed into the empty seat. The leather squeaked under his weight. He smelled of fresh air and perhaps a hint of old tobacco, not unpleasant, but distinct. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled his cap down lower, shielding his eyes, and rested his hands on his knees. The businessman felt his personal space shrinking. He shifted his legs away, creating a physical barrier. He pulled his phone closer to his chest, guarding his territory like a dog protecting a bone. He couldn't concentrate on his emails anymore. He was too aware of the person sitting next to him. The casual dishevelment of his neighbor felt like an insult. It felt like a violation of the sanctuary he had paid so much to enter. The businessman cleared his throat loudly, a harsh, deliberate sound meant to signal his displeasure. He wanted the stranger to know that he was displeased, that this arrangement was beneath him. He expected the stranger to shrink, to apologize, to offer some sign that he knew he was out of place. But the stranger didn't react. He just sat there, breathing slowly, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He seemed completely oblivious to the tension radiating from the man in the suit. He seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin, despite the cheap clothes and the worn boots. The businessman gritted his teeth. He pressed the call button above his head, the light glowing a dim amber. When the flight attendant returned, looking concerned, the man didn't even look at her. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw set tight, communicating his annoyance without saying a single word. "Is everything all right, sir?" the attendant asked softly. "Fine," the businessman snapped. "Just ready to go." He turned his head slightly, just enough to glare at the stranger out of the corner of his eye. The stranger was looking forward now, staring at the seat back in front of him, under the brim of the cap. The businessman caught a glimpse of a beard a bit scruffy and a profile that looked strangely familiar, yet he couldn't quite place it. It didn't matter. Familiar or not, he was still an intruder. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, welcoming them aboard and announcing a flight time of just over 5 hours. 5 hours. The businessman thought dreadfully. 5 hours stuck next to this guy. He crossed his arms tightly over his chest, sinking as far into his seat as possible, trying to physically distance himself from the man beside him. He decided then and there that he would not speak. He would not engage. He would treat this flight as a test of his endurance, a trial to be suffered through until he could escape back to his world of order and perfection. As the plane began to push back from the gate, the stranger shifted slightly, his arm brushing against the businessman's expensive suit sleeve. The businessman flinched, pulling his arm away as if he had been burned. He wiped the sleeve where the contact had happened, a small, petty gesture that made him feel slightly better. He closed his eyes, resigning himself to a miserable journey, completely unaware that the quiet, unassuming man sitting next to him was about to teach him a lesson he would never forget. The wheels of the plane left the tarmac with a sudden, gut-dropping lurch, followed immediately by the steady, powerful roar of the engines as they fought gravity. The businessman stared straight ahead, his white-knuckled grip tightening on the armrests just for a moment. He wasn't afraid of flying, but he hated the loss of control. He hated being strapped into a chair, hurtling through the sky at 500 miles an hour, dependent on machinery and strangers. He much preferred being the one in the driver's seat, the one making the decisions. As the plane climbed higher, the city below turned into a grid of tiny lights and gray roads, eventually disappearing under a blanket of fluffy white clouds. The fasten seatbelt sign dinged off, chiming a sweet, high-pitched note that signaled freedom. The businessman let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for days. He unclasped his seatbelt and immediately shifted his weight, reclaiming his territory in a wide leather seat. Next to him, the stranger in the flannel shirt did the same. He moved slowly, with a sort of heavy, relaxed ease. He unclipped his belt, rubbed his face with his hands, and then settled back, pulling the brim of his baseball cap down even lower over his eyes. He didn't pull out a laptop. He didn't check a stock ticker. He just sat there. The businessman watched him from the corner of his eye, a prickle of irritation returning. It seemed unfair that someone could be so unbothered. The businessman felt like he always had to be doing something, proving something, achieving something. Seeing someone just exist, comfortably and quietly, felt like a challenge to his entire way of life. The sound of a cart rolling down the aisle broke the silence. It was the beverage service. The flight attendant from earlier appeared with a warm, practiced smile. She stopped at their row and looked at the businessman first. "Refill on the sparkling water, sir? Or perhaps something a bit stronger to start the trip?" she asked. The businessman considered it. He wasn't a big drinker, especially in the morning, but he felt the need to mark the occasion of his escape. He wanted something that tasted like money and relaxation. "I'll take a glass of champagne," he said, his voice smooth and commanding. "The top shelf, if you have it." "Certainly, sir." She turned to the stranger. "And for you, sir?" The stranger shifted in his seat, pushing his cap up slightly. His face was kind, his eyes a bit tired but bright. "Just a water, please." "Still water. And maybe some coffee when you have a chance?" "Black." The businessman let out a small, almost imperceptible scoff. He couldn't help it. Champagne versus black coffee. It was a perfect summary of their lives, or at least the lives he imagined they led. One was for celebration and luxury. The other was for fuel and survival. The flight attendant nodded and moved away to prepare the drinks. The businessman felt a sudden urge to speak. The silence was bothering him, mostly because it felt like the stranger was winning it. The stranger seemed content in his shabbiness, and that bothered the businessman more than anything else. He wanted to see a crack in that armor. He wanted to see the stranger acknowledge that he was out of place. "Long trip?" the businessman asked. His tone wasn't friendly. It was the kind of question you ask when you are making small talk just to judge the answer. The stranger turned his head. "Yeah, long couple of weeks. Actually, hoping to get some sleep on the way home." "Home," the businessman repeated, looking at the worn jeans and the scuffed boots. "You heading back to the coast?" "Yeah, just got some work done out east." The businessman swirled the empty water glass in his hand, watching the condensation drip onto his thumb. He took a breath, deciding to go for the jugular. He wanted to see if this guy would break. "This is a nice seat," the businessman said, gesturing vaguely around the cabin. "First class. It's an upgrade for most people. Did you manage to snag a deal online, or?" He let the sentence hang there, the implication heavy in the air. "Or did you spend your life savings on this one flight to feel important for a few hours?" The stranger didn't flinch. He didn't look offended. He just looked at the businessman with a calm, steady gaze. "Yeah, it's a nice seat. Very comfortable. I usually just fly whenever I can get a ticket. So this is a treat." The flight attendant returned with a tray. She set a delicate flute of golden champagne down in front of the businessman, the bubbles rising furiously to the top. Then she placed a simple bottle of water and a cup of steaming black coffee on the stranger's tray table. "Here you are, gentlemen," she said, flashing another smile before moving to the next row. The businessman picked up his champagne, holding the stem delicately. He felt a surge of frustration. His insult had bounced off the stranger like water off a duck's back. The man had either missed the point entirely or was too stupid to realize he was being mocked. The businessman took a sip, the cold liquid sharp and dry. It didn't taste as good as he wanted it to. "You know, The businessman tried again, his voice lowering, leaning in slightly. I've worked very hard to be able to sit in this section. It's not just about the money. It's about the environment. People come here to work, to relax in peace. It's important to respect the dress code, don't you think? He looked pointedly at the stranger's flannel shirt. The stranger looked down at his own shirt, as if noticing it for the first time. He patted the soft fabric. It is comfortable, he said simply. He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes closing briefly as he enjoyed the warmth. When he opened them again, he looked at the businessman. I apologize if I'm disturbing you. I'll just keep to myself. There it was, the apology. But it didn't sound submissive. It sounded genuine. It sounded like a man who was actually sorry for causing trouble, not because he felt inferior, but because he was a decent human being. It made the businessman feel small. It made his expensive suit feel like a costume. The businessman didn't know how to respond to that. He wanted to argue, to push, to establish his dominance, but there was no resistance to push against. It was like trying to punch a cloud. Right. The businessman muttered, turning away. Well, enjoy your coffee. You too, the stranger said softly. The businessman felt his face getting hot. He angrily grabbed his noise-canceling headphones from the slot in front of him. They were large, over-the-ear headphones made of matte black plastic and leather. He jammed them over his ears, instantly cutting off the low hum of the airplane engine. He pressed a power button, and a small blue light blinked on. Silence wrapped around him. He turned his body aggressively toward the window, putting his back to the stranger. He pulled out his tablet and woke it up, bringing up a spreadsheet filled with numbers. He stared at the columns, trying to focus, trying to lose himself in the logic of profit and loss. But his mind kept drifting back to the man sitting inches away from him. Who was he? Why was he so calm? Most people, when confronted with a businessman's obvious wealth and status, got nervous. They tried to impress him, or they shrank away. They knew the hierarchy. But this guy in the flannel shirt, he acted like he didn't care about any of it. He acted like the money and the suit and the champagne were just props in a play he wasn't interested in watching. The businessman peered out the window at the endless expanse of blue sky. He saw his own faint reflection in the glass, a man with a tight jaw and expensive clothes, looking angry at the world. Beside him, the reflection of the stranger showed a man leaning back, eyes closed, hands resting on his stomach, looking completely at peace. It was infuriating. The businessman tried to shake it off. He told himself he was better than this. He was a captain of industry. He didn't need validation from a guy wearing a baseball cap. He zoomed in on a row of numbers, highlighting them in yellow, forcing his brain to do the math. Gross revenue minus operational costs equals net profit. It was a language he understood. It was a world where he was in control. He reached for his champagne and took a larger gulp this time. He needed to relax. He needed to forget about the neighbor. He turned up the volume on the music playing through his headphones, a loud, driving orchestral track that usually made him feel powerful. For a few minutes, it worked. The music swelled. The numbers made sense, and the businessman felt the familiar rhythm of his life returning. He was a king of his castle, even if the castle was currently 30,000 feet in the air. He forgot about the stranger. He forgot about the apology. He forgot about the feeling of smallness that had tried to creep in. He settled into the leather, ready to endure the flight in his own private bubble, convinced that he had won the interaction by simply refusing to participate in it any further. But the silence of the headphones was a lonely place, and the man sitting next to him remained a quiet, stubborn presence that he couldn't quite tune out. The hum of the engines had become a steady, monotonous background noise, a kind of mechanical lullaby that usually helped the businessman zone out. He had managed to focus on a spreadsheet for a solid hour, crossing off tasks and sending terse emails to his assistant. He felt productive. He felt in control. The man in the flannel shirt remained silent in the seat next to him, occasionally sipping his coffee or shifting his weight, but otherwise acting like a piece of furniture. Just as the businessman was starting to feel a sense of calm settle over his section of the cabin, a sharp, high-pitched sound cut through the air. It wasn't the ding of a seatbelt sign. It was the cry of a baby. At first, it was just a whimper, a small noise that was easy to ignore. The businessman didn't even look up from his screen. Babies cried. It was a fact of life, and usually they stopped after a few minutes. But this whimper quickly escalated. It turned into a wail, a loud, piercing shriek that seemed to vibrate against the walls of the pressurized cabin. The businessman sighed heavily, tapping his pen against his tablet. He looked up, scanning the cabin to find the source of the disturbance. It was coming from the row directly in front of him, across the aisle. A young woman was sitting there. She looked to be in her late 20s, dressed in comfortable sweatpants and a loose sweater. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and dark circles sat heavily under her eyes. In her arms, she held a baby who looked no more than 6 months old. The child was red-faced, screaming at the top of its lungs, its tiny fists clenched in anger or pain. The woman was doing everything she could. She bounced the baby up and down. She shushed him gently. She offered him a pacifier, which he immediately spat out onto the floor. She looked flustered, her eyes darting around the cabin, aware that every pair of eyes was slowly turning toward her. The businessman felt a headache starting to form behind his eyes. This was exactly what he had paid to avoid. He didn't pay $3,000 for a ticket to listen to a screaming child. He paid for silence. He paid for exclusivity. He watched the woman with a growing sense of irritation. Why couldn't she quiet him? Why did she bring a baby on a flight like this anyway? Around them, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin began to shift. The peaceful, luxurious bubble was popping. Other passengers started to shift in their seats. A man in a suit across the aisle put down his newspaper and glared. An older woman put her hands over her ears, shaking her head in disapproval. The collective mood of the cabin turned from relaxed to hostile in seconds. The air felt thick with judgment. The baby let out another ear-splitting scream. The sound seemed to bounce off the plastic walls of the plane, amplifying the stress. The businessman had had enough. He couldn't concentrate. He couldn't relax. His sanctuary was under attack. He reached for the call button above his head and pressed it firmly, not once, but twice, jabbing it with his finger. A moment later, the lead flight attendant hurried over, looking concerned. "Is everything all right, sir?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "No, it is not all right," the businessman said, his voice sharp and loud enough for people around him to hear. "I am trying to work, and quite frankly, I paid a significant amount of money to sit in this cabin. I cannot listen to this for the next 4 hours. Isn't there something you can do? Can't you move them? Or give the mother, I don't know, headphones or something?" The flight attendant gave him a sympathetic but strained smile. "Sir, I understand it is disruptive. We are doing our best to assist the mother. Unfortunately, the flight is full, and we cannot move seats. I will check on her again, but please try to be understanding. She is doing the best she can." The businessman scoffed as she walked away. "Understanding," he muttered to himself. "I'm not the one screaming." He looked back at the woman. She was crying now, silent tears running down her cheeks as she tried to rock the baby. The baby was arching his back, clearly uncomfortable. The businessman felt a pang of something, maybe guilt, but he shoved it away. It wasn't his problem. It was hers, and it was ruining his flight. He glanced at his neighbor, the man in the flannel shirt, expecting an ally. Surely this guy would be annoyed too. He had been trying to sleep earlier. The businessman turned to share a look of solidarity. "Can you believe this?" look. But the stranger wasn't looking at the businessman. He wasn't rolling his eyes. He wasn't annoyed. He was watching the mother. The stranger had taken his hat off and placed it on his lap. His dark hair was messy, and he was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. There was no judgment on his face. He wasn't frowning. He was just watching, his brow furrowed slightly in concern. He looked like a man who was seeing a problem and trying to figure out how to fix it. The businessman watched him, confused. Why wasn't he angry? Why was he staring? It was creepy. The baby screamed again, louder this time. The mother let out a small sob, bouncing the baby frantically. "Please, please, hush," she whispered, her voice breaking. The stranger unbuckled his seatbelt. The sound of the buckle clicking open was surprisingly loud in the tense cabin. The businessman leaned back, assuming the man was just going to the bathroom to escape the noise. Good idea, he thought. I should do the same. But the stranger didn't head toward the back of the plane. He stood up and squeezed past the businessman's legs without saying a word. He stepped into the aisle and turned. He walked toward the mother. The businessman stared, his mouth slightly open. What was this guy doing? Was he going to complain? Was he going to yell at her? The tension in the cabin spiked. Everyone was watching. The businessman felt a sudden knot of anxiety in his stomach. If this guy caused a scene, it would be even worse. It would be a disaster. The stranger stopped at the mother's row. He didn't stand over her in a threatening way. He didn't point a finger. He crouched down. He lowered himself to one knee right there in the aisle, bringing himself down to her eye level. It was a submissive posture, non-threatening. He was looking up at her, not down on her. The mother looked up, startled. She brushed a tear away with the back of her hand, looking terrified. She probably thought he was going to tell her to shut her baby up. The businessman held his breath. He couldn't hear what the stranger was saying over the roar of the engine and the crying baby, but he could see the stranger's face. He was smiling. It was a soft, genuine smile that reached his eyes. The stranger said something to the mother. She looked confused for a second, then nodded. He reached out a hand, not toward the baby, but toward her. He picked up the small bag of formula that had fallen on the floor. He handed it to her gently. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his own pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled napkin. He offered it to her. She took it and wiped her eyes. The businessman felt his face flush with heat. He looked around the cabin. The other passengers were watching too, their expressions of annoyance turning into confusion. The man in the suit across the aisle lowered his newspaper. The older woman took her hands off her ears. The stranger didn't leave. He stayed there, crouched in the aisle, talking to the mother. He wasn't telling her to be quiet. He was talking to her about the baby, asking questions, gesturing gently. He looked completely at ease, completely unconcerned with the noise or the stares. He reached out slowly, letting the baby grab his finger. The baby, surprised by the new interaction, stopped crying for a split second to stare at the stranger. The stranger wiggled his finger, making a funny face. It was a silly, cross-eyed face that looked ridiculous on a grown man. For a second, there was silence. Then the baby let out a hiccup. The businessman sat back in his seat, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him was still annoyed that the baby had been screaming. But another part of him, a part he didn't visit very often, felt a sinking feeling of shame. He had judged the woman. He had complained. He had demanded his comfort. And this guy, the one he looked down on for wearing cheap clothes and looking tired, was the one on his knees in the dirty aisle, offering help and kindness. The stranger stood up slowly, said one last thing to the mother that made her smile weakly, and then turned around. As he walked back down the aisle toward his seat, the cabin was quiet. The baby wasn't sleeping, but the screaming had stopped, replaced by soft sniffling. The stranger sat back down next to the businessman. He put his hat back on, pulled the brim low, and buckled his seatbelt. He didn't look at the businessman. He didn't look for praise. He just leaned back and closed his eyes, as if nothing had happened at all. The businessman looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He saw the scruffy beard, the worn-out shirt, the scuffed boots. And then he remembered the way the man had smiled, the way he had knelt down, the way he had made the mother feel seen instead of judged. The businessman cleared his throat, wanted to say something, to break the awkward silence that now felt heavier than the noise had been. But no words came out. He pressed his lips together, turned back to his window, and watched the clouds roll by, feeling smaller than he had when he boarded the plane. The silence that followed the stranger's return to his seat was heavy, but it wasn't the same kind of heavy as before. It wasn't the heavy silence of judgment and annoyance that the businessman had tried to enforce earlier. It was a heavy silence of realization. The cabin air felt different now, charged with quiet energy that made the businessman's skin prickle. He sat there, his tablet screen glowing in front of him, but the numbers meant nothing to him anymore. His eyes kept drifting to the man sitting just a few feet away. The stranger had pulled his cap back down, his arms crossed over his chest, looking for all the world like he was ready to take a nap. How could he just switch it off? How could he go from being a hero in the aisle to a tired passenger in a seat so quickly? The The businessman felt a strange churning in his stomach. It wasn't the turbulence. The plane was flying smoothly through the clear sky. It was something else. It was a feeling of being wrong. He hated being wrong. He built his entire life on being right, on making the smart decisions, on knowing the value of things and people. He had looked at the stranger and calculated his value based on his boots and his shirt, and the calculation had come up zero. But now, watching the way the young mother in the row ahead kept turning around and mouthed a silent thank you to the man, the businessman realized his math was terribly flawed. The flight attendant returned with the meal cart. The aroma of warm bread and roasted chicken filled the cabin. Usually, this was the businessman's favorite part of the flight. He loved the ritual of the tray table, the white tablecloth, and the precise placement of the silverware. It felt civilized. "Can I get you something to drink, sir?" the attendant asked the stranger, pausing at his row. Her tone was different now. It wasn't just professional. It was warm, almost deferential. The stranger opened his eyes, lifting the brim of his cap slightly. "Just water is fine." "Thank you." "And for you, sir?" she asked the businessman, but her attention was still partly on the stranger. "Red wine," the businessman muttered. "The Merlot." As she poured the wine, the businessman watched the interaction. He realized that while he had been demanding service, the stranger had been deserving respect. It was a bitter pill to swallow. The meals were served. The businessman cut into his chicken, but it tasted dry. He chewed mechanically, his mind racing. He looked past the stranger, toward the mother. Her baby was finally asleep, resting heavily against her chest. She was trying to eat her dinner with one hand, balancing the tray on her lap with extreme care. It was a difficult, precarious act. Her elbow slipped and her water glass tipped. She caught it just in time, but a splash of water landed on her tray table. She let out a small, frustrated gasp, wiping it up with a napkin, looking around to see if anyone had noticed. She looked terrified of causing another scene. The businessman watched, feeling a familiar spark of irritation rise up. Just be careful, he thought. Pay attention. But before the thought could fully form, the stranger moved again. He didn't stand up this time. He just leaned across the empty seat between them, the businessman's seat. For a second, the businessman tensed up as the stranger's arm reached near his chest, but he relaxed when he saw what the man was doing. The stranger reached for the extra roll from his own bread basket. He tapped the mother gently on the shoulder. She jumped, turning around with wide eyes. The stranger held out the roll. Then, with a simple gesture, he pointed to her water glass and offered her his own napkin. He smiled that same soft, easy smile. He didn't say a word, knowing that speaking might wake the baby. The mother's shoulders dropped. She looked at the roll, then at him, and her eyes filled with tears again. But this time, they weren't tears of embarrassment. They were tears of gratitude. She took the roll and the napkin, mouthing the words, "Thank you so much." The stranger just nodded and sat back. He picked up his own plastic fork and took a bite of his meal. The businessman sat frozen, his fork hovering in midair. He looked at his own roll, sitting untouched on his plate. He had seen the woman struggling. He had seen her spill the water. He had the power to help her. He had an extra napkin right next to his hand. But he hadn't moved. He had just watched. The contrast was stinging. Here he was, the man who could buy and sell a company, who sat in first class as a reward for his hard work, and he had done absolutely nothing. And next to him sat the man he had dismissed as a bum, who had now helped the same woman twice in 20 minutes. The stranger didn't have an agenda. He wasn't helping her to get an upgrade. He wasn't helping her to look good. He was helping her because she needed help. The businessman put his fork down. He suddenly wasn't very hungry anymore. He cleared his throat. It was an awkward, scratchy sound. He wanted to say something. He felt like he had to say something. The silence was becoming accusatory. "That was decent of you," the businessman said. His voice sounded stiff, even to his own ears. The stranger turned his head slowly. He looked at the businessman, his face unreadable. "She's tired," he said quietly. "Flying with a kid is hard. Everyone has a hard day sometimes." The businessman blinked. He expected a boast. He expected "yeah, I'm a nice guy." He didn't expect such a simple, humble explanation. I suppose, the businessman said, shifting in his seat. Usually people come up here to get away from that kind of chaos. I paid for a quiet flight. That was my angle. The stranger took a sip of his water. He didn't judge the businessman for his honesty. He just looked at him with those calm, dark eyes. It's nice when things are quiet, he agreed. But sometimes you can't control the noise. You can only control how you listen to it. The businessman frowned. What does that mean? The stranger shrugged lightly. You can hear it as an annoyance, something ruining your day. Or you can hear it as a person who needs a little help. It changes the way it feels. The businessman leaned back, his head hitting the headrest. He looked up at the overhead console, counting the little pinpricks of light that simulated stars. He thought about his life. He thought about his office, where he yelled at assistants for bringing the wrong coffee. He thought about his drivers, whom he treated like invisible furniture. He thought about how he measured his worth by how much he could separate himself from the problems of the world. And he looked at this man in the flannel shirt, who seemed to have no walls up at all. He was open to the world, even the noisy, messy parts of it. Do you fly often? The businessman asked, surprising himself. He actually wanted to know the answer now. Yeah, the stranger said. A bit, for work. But I try to remember that everyone is fighting a battle you know nothing about. It makes the trip easier. The businessman felt a lump form in his throat. He reached for his glass of wine and took a long drink, trying to wash away the lump. He felt exposed. He felt like his suit was made of paper and everyone could see right through him. The rest of the flight passed in a blur that felt both slow and fast. The baby slept. The mother slept. The cabin lights dimmed, creating a cozy twilight inside the plane. The businessman tried to work on his tablet again, but he found himself closing the apps. He just stared out the window at the darkness. He watched the stranger doze off. The man slept with his mouth slightly open, his head resting against the bulkhead. He didn't look like a movie star. He didn't look like a tycoon. He looked like a regular guy who was catching a nap on his way home. But the businessman knew better now. He realized that class wasn't about the price of your ticket or the fabric of your suit. It was about how you treated people when no one was watching. It was about noticing when a mother was struggling, even when you were tired yourself. As the pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing the beginning of their descent into the city, the businessman felt a pang of regret. He regretted the cold shoulder. He regretted the snide comments about the clothes. He realized he had spent the last 4 hours sitting next to someone extraordinary, and he had almost missed it because he was too busy looking in the mirror. He unbuckled his seatbelt as the fastened seatbelt sign dinged on. He looked over at the stranger, who was waking up and stretching his arms. "Hey," the businessman said. His voice was softer than it had been all day. I was out of line earlier. About the clothes. And the seat. I'm sorry." The stranger looked at him, blinking the sleep out of his eyes. Then a slow grin spread across his face. It wasn't a mocking grin. It was a forgiving one. He reached out a hand. "Don't worry about it," he said, shaking the businessman's hand with a firm, warm grip. "We all get tired. We all say things we don't mean. It's forgotten." The businessman held on to that hand for a second longer than necessary. He felt a strange sense of grounding, as if the stranger had just anchored him to reality. "Thanks," the businessman whispered. "Welcome," the stranger replied, pulling his cap down as the plane began its drop toward the earth. The businessman sat back, a sense of calm finally washing over him. He didn't know who this man was. He didn't know if he was a teacher, a contractor, or an artist. It didn't matter. He knew what he was. He was a good man. And for the first time in a long time, the businessman felt like he had actually learned something valuable in first class. The landing gear descended with a muffled thud, and the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, announcing their arrival and the local weather. The businessman looked out the window as the city below rushed up to meet them. The buildings were like tiny Lego blocks, the roads like ribbons of gray. Usually, at this point of flight, he would already be unbuckling his seatbelt the second the light dinged off, eager to be the first one off the plane. He treated deplaning like a race he had to win. But today he sat still. He watched the ground whiz by, his mind replaying the events of the last few hours. He thought about the way he had sneered at the stranger's flannel shirt. He thought about the cold comments he had made about the dress code. And then he thought about the stranger kneeling on the carpet, making a silly face to stop a baby from crying. The contrast was like a slap in the face. The businessman realized he had been confusing the price of things with the value of people. The plane touched down, the wheels screeching briefly against the concrete before the engines roared in reverse, slowing the heavy machine down. The bump and jolt of the taxi ride didn't bother him anymore. He didn't check his watch. He didn't check his phone. As the plane pulled into gate and the seatbelt sign finally pinged off, the cabin erupted into the usual cacophony of shuffling feet, clicking belt buckles and opening overhead bins. The businessman stood up slowly. He reached for his briefcase, but then he paused. He watched the stranger in the row ahead. The man wasn't rushing. He was waiting patiently for the aisle to clear. The young mother in front of him was struggling. She had the baby carrier in one arm and was trying to haul a heavy backpack out of the bin with the other. She was wobbling, looking exhausted. Before the businessman could even decide to move, the stranger stepped forward. He reached up with both hands and easily lifted the heavy bag down. He set it gently on the aisle floor for her. The mother turned around, her face lighting up with relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, clutching the baby tight. "I don't know what I would have done without you today. Seriously, you were amazing." The stranger just smiled a humble, crooked smile and waved a hand dismissively. "You did great. He's a good kid. Get home safe." "Wait," she said, fumbling in her pocket. "Can I at least get your name? Or your number? I want to thank you properly. My husband would want to know who helped us." The businessman held his breath, waiting. He realized he didn't know the man's name either. He was curious now. Who was this guy? He wanted to look him up, maybe see if he ran a charity or something. The stranger shook his head softly. He adjusted his baseball cap, pulling the brim low. "No, please. Don't worry about it. Just enjoy your son. That's all that matters." He gently touched the baby's head, turned, and moved into the line of passengers walking toward the exit. The mother watched him go, looking stunned by his humility. The businessman stepped out into the aisle behind him. He felt a strange urge to follow the man, to say something else, to apologize one more time, but the line was moving briskly. They walked through the first-class cabin and into the jet bridge. The air here was cooler, smelling of the airport, a mix of coffee, cleaning fluid, and jet fuel. The moving walkway hummed beneath their feet. The businessman was walking just a few paces behind the stranger. He studied the man's posture. He walked with his head down, shoulders slightly rounded, carrying that small canvas backpack. He looked so incredibly ordinary. They reached the end of the jet bridge where it opened up into the terminal gate. There was a small crowd of ground staff and pilots waiting near the automatic doors, likely waiting to board for the next flight. As soon as the stranger stepped off the moving walkway and onto the carpeted terminal floor, the atmosphere shifted instantly. One of the pilots, a man in a crisp uniform with gold stripes on his shoulders, stopped talking to his co-pilot mid-sentence. His eyes went wide. He actually did a double take, looking back at the stranger walking past him. "Wait a minute," the pilot said, his voice rising in excitement. "Is that—" The stranger kept walking, trying to blend in, but the pilot stepped toward him, blocking his path respectfully but eagerly. "Excuse me," the pilot said, his grin stretching from ear to ear. "I just have to say, huge fan. I loved your last movie. Absolutely loved it." The businessman stopped walking. He stood frozen near the automatic doors, his briefcase hanging from his hand. He watched the scene unfold with confusion. The stranger stopped and looked up. He didn't look annoyed. He looked a little shy. He smiled, shaking the pilot's hand. "Oh, thanks, man. I appreciate it. My wife is going to lose her mind when I tell her." The pilot laughed, pulling out his phone. "Do you mind if I get a quick selfie?" "Sure," the stranger said. He leaned in, not posing like a celebrity, but just standing there like a regular guy posing for a friend. The businessman's brain was struggling to process what he was seeing. He looked at the pilot's face. This wasn't just a random recognition. This was awe. This was the kind of respect people usually reserve for heads of state or superstar athletes. Then, a flight attendant who was standing by the counter gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes sparkling. "Oh my goodness," she whispered to her colleague. "That's Keanu Reeves. He's flying commercial? In a baseball cap?" "Keanu Reeves," the businessman whispered aloud. The name hit him like a splash of cold water. He looked back at the man standing near the pilot. The beard, the eyes, the smile. Now that the name was in the air, the businessman could see it clearly. It was undeniable. The man he had looked down on. The man he had mocked for his clothes. The man he had assumed couldn't afford to be in first class. It was Keanu Reeves, one of the most famous actors in the world. A man worth millions. A man who could charter a private jet to fly to the grocery store if he wanted to. The businessman felt the blood drain from his face. He remembered his snide comment. "Did you manage to snag a deal online?" He remembered thinking, this guy belongs on a Greyhound bus. The irony was so thick it was choking him. He had sat next to a Hollywood icon, a man who had more wealth and fame than the businessman could likely ever dream of, and he had treated him like dirt. And the most unbelievable part wasn't that Keanu Reeves was on the plane. It was how Keanu Reeves had acted. The businessman had prided himself on his status, on his suit, on his first-class attitude. But Keanu, the man who actually had status, had acted with more class than anyone else on the flight. He hadn't demanded special treatment. He hadn't complained about the crying baby. He hadn't acted like he owned the place. He had knelt on the floor to help a stranger. He had given up his own bread roll. He had refused credit. The businessman watched as Keanu finished the selfie, patted the pilot on the shoulder, and turned toward the automatic sliding doors that led to the main terminal. Keanu didn't look back. He just kept walking, hands in his pockets, head down, heading toward the baggage claim like everyone else. The pilot and the flight attendant were buzzing with excitement, recounting the encounter to the stunned ground staff. The businessman stood alone in the center of the commotion, invisible. He looked down at his own expensive suit. He looked at his polished shoes. Suddenly, they didn't feel like armor anymore. They felt like a costume. He realized that while he had been sitting in first class, he had been traveling economy in his soul. And the man in the flannel shirt, the man he had pitied, had been flying first class all along. The businessman took a deep breath, letting out slowly. He adjusted his grip on his briefcase. He didn't try to chase Keanu down. He didn't try to get a selfie. That moment had passed, and he knew he didn't deserve it. Instead, he straightened his back and walked toward the automatic doors. As he stepped out into the busy, noisy terminal, he made a silent promise to himself. He promised that the next time he sat next to someone who looked a little different, or a little messy, or a little tired, he wouldn't look down. He would just say hello. Because you never know when you might be sitting next to a hero who just happens to be wearing a baseball cap. The businessman disappeared into the crowd, a little humbler, a little quieter, and carrying a lesson he would never forget.